My name is Miles Redding and I'll be the host of today's session. And the remit and purpose of today is to talk through IT tenders, the process and how you can best navigate that journey. There's a few slides that we're going to come through today, and there will absolutely be some time for questions and answers at the end. And all the content will be shared shortly after this particular webinar. So don't feel the need to scribble away frantically or take any screenshots. As I said, all the content will be shared. So to kick things off, I just want to, a brief overview of what we want to cover off today in terms of what those objectives are. So I want to cover off the different types of tenders. We definitely get a lot of confusion between sort of an RFP or a typical quoting process, or an ITT would be some of the acronyms that we come across. I want to dispel some of the misconceived ideas and conceptions around those and what the applicability of each one is. Really explore that tender process, that end-to-end engagement, and what steps need to be undertaken to really maximize the process that we're trying to deliver. And then through that, we'll identify some of those best practices, some of those common mistakes, and how you can work that process through to ultimately end up with the right partner at the end of it, which is ultimately the goal of running a procurement process, to find the correct partner that's going to deliver value for you on the services that you're tendering for. General housekeeping, touched on some of this already, but there will be ample time for questions and answers at the end. Equally, if anyone wants a more detailed conversation, we can absolutely arrange that on a one-to-one basis. The session will be recorded and the slides will be shared. And we also have a couple of assets that can be shared upon request. And if anyone's interested in those, please do reach out to Lauren, and her email and contact details are on screen. Those assets are essentially two documents. One provides a tender template, if you like, so the kind of thing you can use to produce your own RFP or ITT. And then there's a supporting document with just some guidance and tips of how to maximize and really complete those documents to the best of your ability. So to kick things off, I really want to just take that step back and really define what that tender is and what that process should look like. So simply, as a definition, is a tender is a formal process where organizations invite suppliers to bid for delivering goods or services. Primary remit as to why people would do it is to ensure that transparency, fairness, and competitive pricing. And actually, some organizations will have governance or regulatory compliance requirements that will dictate they have to go through a tender process. There's then lighter versions of those restrictions where, for example, anything over a spend of X would require multiple bidders to ensure that competitive fairness and no bias was occurred during that process. So the process is really there to make sure you achieve the outcomes that you want. And throughout that process, you can make sure that everything is fair, competitive, transparent, and on a level playing field. So you can relatively easily compare those apples for apples. And in terms of the different types of tenders, once again, there's lots of confusion that comes around this. The way I would badge it or categorize it is there's really three types of tenders that we see. There's open tenders, which would typically be through publicly available frameworks, whether that be things like G-Cloud, Tenders Direct, or any of those kind of portals online, where essentially an organization will put their remits or their requirements of scope online, and qualified bidders that have access to said portal or frameworks can ultimately just apply. There's pros and cons to that. Ultimately, you can test the market to its fullest extent, but there's no limit to the amount of organizations that can ultimately bid. We then have selective tenders, where organizations will actually produce their tender documents and send them to a short list of suppliers, which typically they'd already pre-agreed. That might be 3, 4, 5. We see some that send it to 8 to 10. There's no silver bullet or right answer for that. It's very much depending on the kind of process that you want to run. I'd always say just be conscious of the volume of people you invite. As for every bidder that you invite, you'll have their bid to review, you'll have interviews, you'll have PQQs, you'll have due diligence to conduct. So the greater the volume of bidders, the greater the work and the length of the process, typically. And then there's negotiated tenders, which is probably far less common. Certainly the top two in terms of open and selective are most commonly used tender processes that we see. But a negotiated tender would be a direct discussion with a supplier. So not necessarily competitive, where there's multiple people going through that process, but you might go to a single supplier with a specification or remit and ask them for a best endeavours bid or a best price. From that point, you can then decide to proceed or use that as the baseline to then run a different process. But those are really the three different types of tenders that we see that are commonly used, certainly across most of the industries that we operate. And then as the next step, I wanted to really delve into the different types of tenders in terms of the processes that people run. And for us, there's two key acronyms that often get used. There's ITT, which would be an invitation to tender. And for us, this is a formal and detailed specification of what you want. There's no ambiguity here, and it requires bidders to meet that exact requirements that you've outlined. So it works really well for organizations where they have well-defined project or services or remits that they want bidders to bid against. It's quite prescriptive, but it gives you a really clear outcome, and it's far easier to manage that process from end to end. The second type of tender that we see is what we call a request for a proposal or an RFP. And this is generally far more broad and more flexible, and it allows suppliers to be creative in terms of you'll give them a problem, and the onus is then on them to devise a solution. But you don't know or have clearly defined that solution. A really obvious one would be, from an IT perspective, is hosting. You have servers that you want to host and manage those off-site, but you don't have a preference on the cloud platform that is going to be utilized, whether that be AWS, Azure, or private cloud. So you present a problem, and the onus is then on the bidder to present the solution. It works really, really well for complex or innovative projects where you're looking to leverage the expertise of the bidders that you've gone to run this particular procurement process. Once again, there's pros and cons to each, which I want to expand on a little bit here. So in terms of the ITT, the real clear pros is it's clear and specific deliverables. It's far easier to compare that apples for apples because everyone's bidding against the same requirement and scope, and it ensures that compliance with those exact standards. The downside of the ITT is it does limit the flexibility that bidders have. As I said, it's quite prescriptive. You're asked to bid against a predefined specification. So sometimes you lose some of that innovation that you might want to seek from the chosen partner. Time sensitive to draft the detailed specifications. Running a really good ITT requires a lot of work up front because you need to fully understand the current estate, the requirements, and what you want to achieve from running that process. And the onus is then on you as the organization that's running the process to provide that information to the bidders. And similarly to that limiting of flexibility and innovation, you might not necessarily capture some of those emerging or unique approaches or exciting technologies that are coming just because you're asking them to bid against that exact standard that you've outlined. And similarly for an RFP process, it's almost flipped. So the pros are absolutely, you encourage that innovation. You're asking bidders to come up with their tailored recommendation based on what problem you've shared. Downside of that particular one, it's far harder to compare apples for apples. You might have two bids that you like, but actually they excel on one area and they're different on another. It just needs to be considered when you're going through that scoring criteria or that decision point. It's far more flexible and it evolves throughout that process. But the risk of that is that you might be too vague in terms of the problem that you share, and therefore the proposals that you receive aren't necessarily addressing some of the problems that you want them to, or they go down off a bit of a tangent, which once again isn't directly linked to what you're trying to achieve. The other benefit, it actually allows some really good collaboration. In my experience, some of the best RFP processes are actually run almost in partnership with those that are bidding. They'll come to site, they'll do their due diligence, they'll have a bit of a workshop with you on site. And certainly the good bidders will invest that time up front to really understand the problems that we're trying to address. But once again, the downside of that, it requires far more time and resource to run that process and far more time for evaluation and clarification throughout that. So I would summarize it, I guess the differences is really the ITT is going to be more focused on price and compliance. It's going to require more resource up front, but less resource throughout that process. And the RFP is going to be more focused on innovation and solution quality, requires less effort and resource up front, but it's probably more involved from that scoring, evaluation, and collaboration process. There's not necessarily a right answer as to what is the right fit for you. It should be dictated by the services or products or projects that you're looking to procure and how far through your assessment phase, I guess, you are to outline what the requirements or project spec that you are looking to achieve. So to then play this forward, we often get asked, well, why should I go to tender? They're expensive, they're time consuming, they're costly, and it doesn't always yield the right response. So I would always say, make sure you're really clear as to why you're going to tender and what you're looking to achieve as part of it. And I've got on screen over the next couple of slides, a couple of reasons that I think you should be going to tender. So why you should go to tender. First one would be the review of the market. You might be in a contract for at least 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years in some cases, and you now need to essentially just assess the market. What's out there? Technology has moved at such a pace that realistically, if you've not gone out to test that market every 2-3 years or keeping abreast with the latest technology, There may be things that you're missing. You might be overpaying, you might be underpaying, but there's a need to actually test that market and ensure that the services that you're getting delivered or buying are still fit for purpose and leveraging some of those emerging technologies. The second side of things is actually just a need to reshape the services. What you put in place maybe 2-3 years ago was great back then, but things have moved so quickly. Actually, you've got now requirements or holes within that portfolio that need to be plugged or addressed. A really obvious one from an IT perspective is that need for cyber provision. Probably 5-10 years ago, a lot of the cyber services that we were delivering were viewed as a nice to have. Now I'd say that's far more of a necessity, and people are far more clued up and educated on the risk of not having some of those provisions in place. So a lot of the reasons that we're seeing that some people go to tender is actually just the existing provision isn't quite as fit for purpose as it needs to be. And there's that need to reshape, redesign, or rescope some of the services that are being delivered. The most common one is probably the third. You're dissatisfied with the service that is being delivered and you don't feel those issues can be resolved. You've moved beyond the point, you've lost confidence, you've lost faith, whatever those reasons are. The most common reason people would go to tender would be that they're unhappy with their current supplier, and that's a perfectly valid reason. What I would say is to be really clear on the problems that you experience in your existing relationship and outline those in that tender document so you can address them throughout that process. If, for example, you're unhappy with the call response times that you're receiving in your current agreement from an IT service perspective, I'd be really clear and outline what you want. What does good look like? And ask the bidders to outline their process or statistics to support what they're proposing. And the final one is regulation. So some organizations are dictated that every 3 years, every 5 years, they have to go back out to market to test that and run a proper and efficient procurement process as part of that. So some organizations will simply be dictated that they have to go to tender every X amount of years. The flip side of this is actually why shouldn't you go to tender? And I don't think this conversation happens enough as to why shouldn't I go. As I said, they're costly, they consume a lot of time and resources. There's going to be an element of risk. Cost of onboarding a new supplier typically outweighs that for staying with your provider, but to stay with them, you've got to be really clear of the rationale as to why you're doing that. So the questions I often get asked is why shouldn't I go to tender? And the 3 reasons that I've put on screen here are what I would deem those main reasons and rationale. If you are happy receiving a good service and there's a good partnership in place with the existing provider and you just want to re-sign, I wouldn't recommend going through a costly process to do that. It's costly, consumes a lot of time and money. And if you just want to stay with where you are, have that conversation with your provider. I'm sure they'll be very receptive to that. Secondly, if the goal is just to reduce the price, you may have to go to market if your incumbent's not willing to get to the point that you want to. But a sensible conversation in the first iteration is absolutely going to be the path of far less resistance than running a really heavy procurement process or tender process to achieve the outcome. And the third one that I often come across is just people are unsure what they want. And whilst you could potentially run an RFP where you encourage some of that creativity from a bidding perspective, you need to be really clear what the outcomes are. What does good look like and what you're looking to achieve? If you're not sure what that is and you can't accurately define that or depict that to somebody, I would suggest you're either not ready or running a tender process isn't the right thing at this particular stage. We'll come on to some of the analysis that's needed ahead of a typical tender process, but those are the 3 reasons why I would recommend consideration or stopping to take note as to why we want to do this process. And I've touched on at the bottom, some organizations just have to go to tender every few years as part of their regulation and procurement guidelines in place. So in my mind, what does a typical process look like? And I've tried to simplify this as best as I can, and I'll expand on a couple of these sections a bit more in the upcoming slides. But a 3-stage process for me would really consist of these 3 stages. The first one would be the analysis phase. So this is to really understand the current state of the nation. What does my house look like in terms of my contractual position? Are there any gaps or pain points in the current service provision that we want to address? And what is my internal capabilities and resourcing look like? Are there any gaps in that point? And what do we think the future looks like? Because when you're running a tender process, you're not just procuring a service for day one. You're entering into a partnership. So you need to consider actually what you need on day 1, month 12, month 24, and month 36, depending on the length of that agreement. And you want someone that can evidence their ability to meet your current needs and your future changing and growing needs. So the analysis phase is very much internal. What do I have? What do I need? What are the gaps? And what am I trying to address? The more clear and the better your understanding of your starting point will make the next couple of phases far easier to work through and will always deliver a better outcome. So I would always stress the emphasis on investing time up front in terms of what we've defined as that analysis phase. The second part of that is what I would call the definition phase, where you define the requirements. And that should be both technical and business. The IT strategy should underpin the business strategy, and both need to be considered. You need to be able to outline what good looks like. What are the key deliverables of the project you're looking to procure or run that process for? And then how do you engage the right stakeholders internally to capture their diverse perspective, their individual needs, whether that be departmentally, that they've all got their nuances in terms of systems or features they're looking to leverage, or whether it be operationally in terms of actually require different levels of support or access from an IT perspective. So analysis, internal, time up front to understand where you are, define actually outlining what you want to achieve from this particular process. What are you asking people to bid against? And then the final stage is arguably the least involved from an internal perspective, is that selection process. What's the process that you're going to run? How are you going to engage those providers? How are you going to identify who to invite? And what's the process going to look like? I would always recommend a lot of due diligence on the partner. Said you're entering into a long-term relationship. You want to validate what they've told you and talk to some of their customers as well. And I always find a transparent weighted evaluation model will make your lives far simpler when you're running through that process, particularly when organizations come and ask for feedback on said bid if they were unsuccessful. Ability to refer back to a objective secure scoring matrix will make your life far easier in that. So they're the three stages that we see in terms of analysis, definition, and selection. Weighting is definitely front heavy in terms of the internal time required to undertake that analysis and definition phase. And if you invest the time up front, that selection phase should be far, far simpler. And what I've tried to do on a couple of the subsequent slides is really map out some of the specific elements I would look at and focus on for that analysis, definition, and selection phase. So the first one is the analysis piece. So this is the process to understand my current state. What does my existing environment look like? There's almost no consideration on the future for this particular phase. This is purely what have I got now? And this should be looking at everything from the capabilities, infrastructure review, the risks review, cost analysis, cyber capability, and the current performance. And in turn, that creates almost that gap analysis. What have we got? What do we need? And what are we missing? If you can accurately outline that current state, it will then make the definition phase much easier because you're then outlining what you want. So this should help you identify those pain points, those problems, and ultimately what good looks like as you go through this process to decide what the outcomes need to be. So really focus on defining that current state. The definition is understand the process to get to the desired state. So you've gone through understanding the current state. This is where we are now. The desired state is where you want to get to. So you need to be able to outline what are those strategic goals. Are there desired projects or required projects that need to be implemented in order to get there? How do we reduce the risks that have been identified from that analysis phase? How do we want to deliver this? What does the service provision look like? How does it augment the existing team, or is it outsourced in its entirety? Budget is always going to be a key one, and I would always recommend include a indicative budgetary figure on a tender process. Doesn't mean you have to be held to that, and people might create or present offerings which are of interest with additional value. But I think it helps narrow the mind and field of focus for people responding to said tenders to know what the realms of possibility are they're working within. Operational objectives, what are you trying to achieve? And the outcome of this should be a really detailed service specification, which you can then incorporate into the tender process that you're asking bidders to bid against, or use creativity to address that problem. But the outcome of this phase should be a really clear documented service specification, which is the key document when you're asking bidders to bid, essentially. And then once you've gone through that period of what have we got now, the current state, what do we want, the desired state, we can then look to expand on sort of the process to select the right partner. So I've got on screen here basically what I would deem those 6-7 steps and process that you need to go through. Step one will always be issuing the RFP. That's sending it out to the select partners that you want to include if you're running a select tender, Or if you're going through an open tender, that would be publishing it on one of these frameworks with a time frame by which bidders need to respond with. Once you then issued that, the bidders will then go through their process, whether that be on-site visits, due diligence, Teams calls just to do some Q&As, clarification questions, whatever that engagement then looks like. The next step will ultimately be you receive the bids back against the tender that you've shared. There's then a period where you review those bids, which is a time-consuming exercise, but is worth investing the time to really understand where people stand out, how can you compare apples for apples, and what the scoring looks like for each of those bidders. And once you've gone through that review process, you can then create a shortlist. And I would always recommend creating a shortlist, inviting them in for an in-person meeting, whether that be presentation or an interview of some description. But creating that shortlist and asking them to come in and be personable, I think adds weight to the bidders. You're not just buying a product a lot of the time, certainly with an IT services tender. You're buying in a partner. You need to make sure that you can work with them for a prolonged period of time. This isn't a transactional engagement where you're buying a PC a lot of the time. You're asking people to give you peace of mind, to trust you, trust them, to look after your IT and make sure everything is online, working and performing as it should do. And I think that is sometimes difficult to gauge that trust element from a cold bid. So I would issue the RFP, assess those bids, create a shortlist, and I would typically have no more than 3 organizations on that shortlist. Invite them in for a presentation or an interview of some description. And the outcome of that is that you should have a preferred provider of those 3 that have been shortlisted. I would then always strongly recommend due diligence. And that could be reference checks, speaking to their clients. It could be financial background to make sure they're of a decent standing and stable as an organization. And I'd also recommend going to visit the office, see how they operate, see how the team's structured, how their staff engage with everybody when they're on the ground. Once again, you're engaging with a partner. You're not just buying a product, certainly when running an IT services piece. Once you've conducted that due diligence piece and you're confident that you've got the right partner that you can work with that will deliver the necessary value, you enter that negotiation piece. Now, that could be commercial. The often one is typically legal, where you're negotiating that contract to make sure those clauses and the terms align and provide security for both the bidder and the supplier. And then the final element of the selection piece is probably what everyone assumes this stage involves, which is ultimately the signing of those agreements from both parties. So those 3 stages, the analysis, the definition of the selection, ultimately give you the start to the end of what that process should entail. What I then wanted to touch on very briefly is the next slide is actually the timelines of what we see that you should be incorporating when you're running this kind of process. And one of the big challenges that we see when we're bidding and helping organizations run tender is simply not allowing enough time at any one of the phases that you can see on board. So preparation, tendering period, evaluation to decisions, transition and implementation. The preparation phase is really the analysis and the definition, because that is all internal. That's you understanding where things are, how things sit, how they fit together, and what you want to achieve from this process, outlining that specification. Whilst this can be done in a shorter time frame, I think a realistic expectation of that is typically 4 to 8 weeks, as sometimes you'll be reliant on your incumbent provider to provide some of that information, and that way may naturally take some time. The tendering period would then be you publish the RFP or the ITT, and you allow bidders time to respond. Too often do we see timelines of 7 days, 2 weeks, even 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks in some instances. Whilst you don't want to elongate the process unnecessarily, there needs to be an element of consideration that you're asking bidders to invest a lot of time, effort, and resources to actually provide a really succinct and competent bid in response to the tender documents that you've shared. Whilst I think 8 weeks is probably slightly too long, if you were to break this down, you might have 2 to 3 weeks for initial clarification questions. And that's whereby they review the documents you've shared and they have the option to go and do a site visit or submit questions that can then be shared with the wider bidders. You then might have a bidding phase of say 4 weeks. So give people 4 weeks from the close of the clarification questions to actually submit their bids in the format that you request. Then there might actually be a clarification phase. So another 2 weeks or so, whereby you go back and clarify any ambiguity or unknown or uncertain areas of those bidders' proposals. So I've listed on there it's 4 to 8 weeks. I would say it's a minimum of 4 weeks to run that process and no more than 8 weeks, factoring those elements that I've just discussed. Evaluation decision, I would typically say, is 2 to 4 weeks. So that's reviewing all the bids, undertaking your scoring internally, inviting them in for an interview or tender presentation, and ultimately making your decision, selecting your preferred partner. I would also always recommend pre-booking those presentation dates or interview dates. So once again, once you come to that decision and evaluation, there's no challenges or uncertainties to try and get them in on the agreed dates and times. They're pre-agreed, and it just allows for a more succinct process. And then the bit that I see get overlooked a lot is actually allowing time for that transition and implementation. I see bids, for example, said decision will be made on the 1st of May, and we need everything in place by, say, the 20th of May. Certainly for an IT managed service, we would typically request 3 months as a minimum, but probably no more than 6 months with a period of overlap from the existing incumbent. But please don't underplay or underthink the amount of time that's needed to successfully transition services. From a bidder's perspective, we get one chance to make a first impression when delivering an IT services, and it's not something we like to rush because there's risks and security and compliance elements that potentially get compromised. So allowing a thorough and detailed process to actually onboard the procured services will help, and whilst not strictly part of that tender process, should be considered as part of that transitional phase. And the final part of that timeline of resources, typically the people that we would recommend are involved in that process. So involved on that decision-making committee or that evaluation piece. So you'd have an exec sponsor that provide the strategic oversight from an IT or MIT perspective. I would typically see that as the budget holder, whether that be an IT director, a finance director, a managing director, whatever it may be, that executive sponsor that's ultimately going to own that function internally. You'd then have the project lead. That may well be the same person. It may not be. You might have an IT director, an IT manager, or you might have somebody within your team that is their point of contact or power user from an IT perspective. Similarly with sort of subject matter experts or power users, I would recommend including them. What you don't want is 10, 15 people in the room. I would say trying to keep it to 4 or 5 will give you a balanced view, but also make the scoring criteria and the outcomes far easier to coordinate and deliver. You might have a need for some legal or procurement expertise in the room, or if you're a charity or a not-for-profit, trustees may insist on being there as well from a governance perspective. But 3 to 5 people, I would say, is a minimum, covering the exec sponsor, the project lead, the primary point of contact, or subject matter experts or power users within the business. I'd say if you can get coverage of those 3, 4, 5 elements, you'll have the right people in the room to make the informed decision following the completion of that process. And then the final couple of elements is how we actually select the right partner. What does good look like? And whilst there isn't a silver bullet here, there's a few tips and tricks that I thought would be useful to share. So key considerations for us would be experience and industry expertise, cultural fit and working relationship I've touched on already, that need to undertake that due diligence. Can I work with these people? Financial stability, certainly in today's economic climate, there is uncertainty out there. And if you're entrusting an organization to run and look after your IT, you want to make sure they're going to be around for the duration of that contract and there's no risk there. Innovation and future-proofing definitely should be part of that consideration. So if you're entering a partnership, you want someone that's going to move, evolve, and improve with you to make sure you're able to leverage technology as it emerges and becomes available to the masses. Transparency, communication, and reporting are now a given, but everything is so data-led, and certainly I think you can get a lot from drilling into the detail of what is currently shared. So asking for some quantification of service metrics as an example, seeing an example service reports. What transparency will you be provided through the procurement of this service? Referenceability, make sure you undertake your due diligence, speak to some of their clients, even ask to speak to a client that's recently left as to understand the reasons that they did. And what added value are they going to bring above and beyond what you're purchasing? Certainly from an MIT perspective, as an example, most people will have a service desk. What are they going to add above and beyond that that's really going to make them stand out? And then how do you evaluate those bids? I would always recommend having weighted scoring models and predefine what that looks like. So then when you're going through that scoring criteria, it's objective, not subjective. Undertake that due diligence, and if you can, score that as well. Score the references that you're taking, score the site visits, and collate that into one centralized score. And one element that I don't think it's used a lot, and it's sometimes harder with service procurement than it is project procurement, but running things as a proof of concept. Actually saying, I think you're the preferred partner. What we'd like to do is give you a test for a 3-month period, or why don't you implement this subset of the services that we're procuring just to see the value that they'll deliver. If you're unsure, it's a great way to build that confidence and make sure you're engaging with the right partner. And most bidders would be very receptive to that, as it gives them a chance to prove their worth early on. And then for me, the final bit is what I would call sort of the 6 rules for success. And these were rules I would recommend you abide to achieve a good outcome and run a successful process. So bids must be submitted on time. If you outline a timeline, they should be submitted. Attention to detail is a very real thing, certainly from an IT perspective, and failure to meet a deadline, I don't think sets a good expectation from the outset from a bidder. Gut feel is very, very important. If it doesn't feel right early on, your instincts probably are correct, and don't underestimate that cultural fit. You need to be able to work with these people. Attention to detail I've touched on. Failure to read the documents properly, failure to submit things in the right format, I would say is a lack of attention or lack of care, which once again could be reflective of the services and them as a partner. Not always, but it could be. So I would really query a lack of attention from bids. Site attendance, I would have weighting on this as a plus point. If a bidder is willing to invest at their own time and cost, someone going to site to really understand the environment, undertake their own due diligence from a bidder's perspective, it's a good indicator that they've got the right approach, the right mindset, and want to submit a really succinct and valuable bid. The onboarding process is a key part. I actually see too many tenders not even ask for that onboarding process. I would recommend that you ask bidders to outline how they are on board and try to transition those services. But it must be believable, well evidenced and documented. And once again, you can reinforce that with reference checks to speak to clients that have been through similar onboardings previously. And a big one which comes up now is demonstratable experience of cyber incidents. Where their clients have had a breach or attack, how have they responded? What did they do? What did that process look like? Whilst no one likes to talk about it, we live in a climate now where it's more likely when as opposed to if a breach would happen. So having that peace of mind that you've got the right partner in place to support you should that happen will help massively should that day ever come. And the final 2 slides for me is what we would deem sort of the common mistakes and how we can best manage some of those changes. I won't talk through all of these here because I'm conscious there's a fair bit on here, but some of which we've touched on already. So poorly prepared tender document, for example, will result in lots of resource time, clarification questions, and ultimately result in a poor end result. Too many bidders, very similarly, it might get confusing with the volume of content you've got to review and dissect. And once again, the more bidders you have, typically the more time and resources you have to invest to run that process. The big one for me is buzzwords. An example I put on there is bring the latest in AI innovation to the area of, and it could be anything, system use or reporting. Unless you're really clear on what you want the output to be, it's almost just words. You need to be really clear on what you want them to bid against or what you're looking to address as the problem. If you can't be clear, you're just going to get ambiguity, and that causes confusion both from your scoring, both from the bidder's perspective and actually from the output, because you're not entirely clear on what good looks like. And then not granularly clarifying bids is the other element of it, which is this one here from the second bottom. So understanding exactly what a bidder means when they say something. If you're unsure, ask that clarification question, which is why we baked that into that evaluation period of that 4 to 8 weeks, because you should be going back to clarifying it. Once you've signed that contract, it's almost too late. You've contractually committed or contractually procured a service. So if there's any element of uncertainty, ask as part of that initial process. And the final element I just wanted to touch on before I wrap up with some key takeaways is how do we best manage that change? And there's a few bits on here that I just wanted to briefly touch on. There's lots of components to this specific piece. We could probably run a whole nother webinar in terms of the transition of services. But these are 3 areas that I think should have a bit of extra focus on and a bit of extra understanding when you're looking to undertake a fundamental change like changing your IT service provider. The first one would be communication to staff. A change of that nature has a big impact on people in terms of their day-to-day operation. There's definitely an element of hearts and minds, and in my experience, where it's done really well is you bring people along that journey with them. And that could be as simple as, we're going to be running this procurement process. This is the reasons why. This is the time frame that we're working towards. This is the potential impact to you as a user. And this is what we hope to achieve as an outcome. It just helps manage and set those expectations, because change typically comes with the risk of some disruption. And you want to bring people along that journey and really to buy in the decision making that you're having. And then the final part of that communication with staff is really that training and support. How are you going to bring them along to best educate and inform them to fully leverage the new services, solutions, or projects or products that you're looking to implement? Don't overlook the hearts and mind piece with staff. The second part is what I would call two-way project management, with PM there meaning project management. Too often we see is that the onus is entirely on the incoming provider to manage that project. That works to some extent, but it often overlooks actually the key stakeholders in this, which is ultimately the organisation staff. And most external PMs just won't manage that side of it because it's outside of their specific remit from that project. So the external project delivery will be managed and owned by the incoming provider, but there needs to be an element of ownership internally as to how you're going to transition that. What's the communication strategy going to look like? Is there going to be training sessions or drop-in sessions? How do you clearly define those roles and responsibilities between the two organizations to make sure all stakeholders come along that journey? So at the point of that go live, whether it be July 1st, October 1st, whatever it may be, everyone knows what's happening, what to do, what not to do, and what good looks like on that day of go live. And the final element is actually almost a step before all of this. It's actually understanding your current contract. I've seen some horror stories where people run a tender process and they find out they didn't serve notice in their time frame and they were stuck in that contract. I've seen some really, really bad examples where they get stung with some huge offboarding charges because that conversation wasn't held up front. So I would strongly recommend understand your current contractual position. Make sure you serve notice early enough where you can run that complete procurement framework. And if you're stuck, typically the incumbent will be flexible and allow you to go into monthly rolling, but you just need to have that conversation ahead of time. So understand your notice period, understand that existing contractual position and your ability to run that process, and then absolutely agree and get in writing what those offboarding charges would be. It will just avoid any ambiguity or pain and cost further down the line. So in terms of the key takeaways for me, I'm conscious I've probably overrun a little bit on time, so I do apologize, but be really clear about your objectives. What do you want to achieve? What does good look like in your mind, and hold people to that standard? Choose the right process for you. Is it an RFP? Is it an ITD? Is it an open tender? Is it a select tender? Is it a negotiated tender? No one can tell you what the right one is other than yourselves, based on what you're looking to achieve, the time and resource that you have to invest, and what good looks like as an outcome. For me, a lot of the processes win or fail based on the time invested up front to really undertake that analysis and definition phase. Allow sufficient time for that process and find the right partner. Emphasis on the word partner here. You're typically not procuring a product. You're buying a suite of services or solutions which is going to deliver measurable value over a long-term contract. And don't underegg the need to manage that change, both internally and externally. So that for me sort of concludes what we wanted to cover off today in terms of navigating that world or sphere of IT tenders. If you do have any questions, please do raise them now and we'll jump on and get through as many of those as possible. If for whatever reason we don't get through those, we'll make sure to reach out for any of the questions that weren't answered. The team will shortly share the slides along with any other information that's been requested. And if you would like access to the tender assets that we've produced, please do just reach out to Lauren Willoughby, whose details are going to be on slide 1. But beyond that, thank you ever so much for your time.